the Sermon on the Mount. I want to see what the introduction is to the Sermon on the Mount. This is strange because it looks like Michael Root has the leper is healed after the first Sermon on the Mount. And I wonder what he means by the first Sermon on the Mount. Event 62. Oh, okay. Yeah, he has that final calling of the disciples, and then just before the leper is healed, which comes right after in Luke, he has the Sermon on the Mount. Then, right after that, goes into healing of the leper. But that's not the point. The point is that, well, you know what? The Sermon on the Mount is not recorded in the other Gospels. I know there's a similar passage in Luke, but that is actually not the Sermon on the Mount. It clearly says that's the Sermon on the Plain when he says, "Blessed are the poor, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness." I don't know if it's exactly that. I just know that it's similar in Luke, but it's not the same. It says clearly he's on a plain, not a mountain. What comes right before the Sermon on the Mount? He calls the disciples. Yeah. Oh, I guess that's it. There's nothing else. It goes right into the Sermon on the Mount. I thought there was a lot more that happened. Well, no, that's apparently how Michael Root sees it. Okay, I'm going to continue checking up on this. Matthew goes right into the Sermon on the Mount. Mark. Oh, I know. Okay, the next thing in Mark, after he heals the leper, he's in a house, and then they lower the man from the ceiling. That's right. That's what happens next. Pharisees is the doctors. Yep, that's the next thing in Luke, right after the leper is healed. I wonder if that's in John as well. I wonder when I have to get back to John. Feeding of the 5,000. You know, I think John just skips a whole bunch of stuff and then adds stuff that no one else talks about. Oh, look at that. And then it goes all the way to Lazarus being sick. Yeah, so John skips a whole lot and then adds information that no one else does from a few sections. So Matthew, when does Matthew mention the man lowered down from the ceiling, from the roof? It says in Matthew, he healed the leper after the Sermon on the Mount. So I'm definitely putting the Sermon on the Mount first. In between his calling of the disciples in Luke and then his healing of the leper in Luke. The late mention of him healing Peter's wife's mother. Scribes came. Oh, and then he calms the sea. The Gadarene demoniac, although here it's country of the Gergesenes. 2 possessed with devils instead of just 1. He sends them into the swine. And then they brought the man sick with palsy lying in a bed. It doesn't mention that they lower him from the ceilings, but I'm pretty sure that's it, because the response is the same from the scribes saying this man blasphemes. Okay, so in chapter 9 of Matthew is when they lower the man down. That's after the Sermon on the Mount, after he heals the leper, after he calms the sea. In Mark, it just goes right from, he's preaching all over, he heals the man with leprosy, and they lower the man from the ceiling. So Mark skips a lot. Luke, he calls them, he heals the leper, and they lower the man in the bed. Okay, so it's similar in Mark and Luke. There's more information in Matthew. I'll go to Luke. He does his final calling of the disciples. They have that large catch of fish. Then the Sermon on the Mount. The question of what comes next is concerning the Sermon on the Mount and what events surround it. What happens before, right after. And the reason why this is a big deal is because in Matthew, it's very similar, but much more inclusive of different preaching and teaching of what Jesus says than in Luke. A similar sermon is in Luke, but there's debate of whether or not it's the same one. The healing of the leper happens just after the sermon in Matthew, but in Luke it happens way before. So the real question is whether or not these two sermons are the same. If they are the same, I would definitely go with Luke, because as I find out later, Matthew puts events in various order just to prove a point. And I'll get into much more detail in that in a few videos. But I realize Luke and Mark are both more reliable than Matthew when it comes to the timeline. And that kind of opens the floodgates to almost never relying on the timeline in Matthew. So the question again, is the Sermon on the Mount the same as the sermon in the plain, which I'll call the one from Luke? And I have a few issues to talk about this. Also later on, I'll find more works like this. I didn't know about them at the beginning, but they're out there. The Life of Christ in Stereo. This one has the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain as the exact same. Puts them both together. By Johnston M. Cheney. The Merged Gospels is by Gary Crossland. He also says that the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain are the exact same. Now, there are some similar works on the internet that are not printed One is the Combined Gospels by Graham. He also, I'm not sure if he came to this on his own or just went with what they said, but he also believes and put in his work that the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain are the same. The Composite Gospels, or the Composite Gospel, by Dr. Michael Brown from creationscienceprophecy.com, also, again, has the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain as the exact same. Now, Michael Rood does not. And at first I went with him. Okay, I'm kind of giving myself away. At first I went with him with his idea that the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain are totally separate. And I go through the entire Sermon on the Mount, but then afterwards, again, as you'll see, I realize that there are some portions that are so similar, I might as well combine them with Luke. Move them over to Luke and put them together. And I'll keep them as separate sermons, but have whatever is different still in Matthew, whatever's the same in Luke. Again, because Matthew is unreliable in regards to timeline and Luke is more reliable, I have them separate. But then I came across these and saw that they've all put the healing of the leper early, right after this, right after Jesus goes out and preaches all around and casts out devils, and just after he finally calls the 4 disciples when they're fishing and they follow him. And as it follows in Luke, I just go right along with that. But that was because, the way they do it is because they have those 2 sermons combined. And they put the Sermon on the Mount later. So automatically, the healing of the leper would have to come before. The issue, however, is that I'm not convinced those 2 sermons are the same. And I was really close to moving the healing of the leper to before the Sermon on the Mount, whether or not they were the same, just because the others did that. However, I looked up in the notes of the Merged Gospels. He has probably the most extensive notes in the appendix at the back. The others have some notes here and there on issues, but he has one important note, and I'll actually read it to you. Appendix 1, Note 5, the Sermon on the Mount. According to the Merged Gospels, Matthew's Sermon on the Mount and Luke's Sermon on a Level Place, or the Plain, are different versions of the same sermon. If one visits the actual site in Galilee where all of this happened, Eremos Heights, one will observe a hill with a level place slightly below the summit, suitable to accommodate about 200 to 300 people. This means that it is a mountain, actually more like a hill, as Matthew describes it, but also has a level place as Luke describes it. Now, I'm going to read the second paragraph as well, but I'm going to rebut what he says. Secondly, there are so many similarly worded and successive parallel phrases between Matthew's version of the sermon and Luke's version that the conclusion that it is the same sermon is virtually unavoidable. From time to time, there are commentators who believe that the 2 are different sermons. However, the language included in both is too close to support this belief. All right. First of all, Eremos Heights, where this happened, supposedly happened in Galilee, is not certainly where this happened. I looked up Eremos Heights online and read some notes about it, and they reference that Jesus often goes to a solitary place. And solitary is, in Greek, eremos. Eremos does mean, as it uses in King James Version, like a desert place, or secluded, or remote, or solitary, as mentioned in Mark 6:32, which is just before the feeding of the 5,000, and the same in Matthew 14:13, Luke 9:10. And that's all, again, the same situation. You go to a solitary place, and that's where the crowds gather, and he feeds the 5,000. But that is not what's said when Jesus goes up into the mountain, here, before the Sermon on the Mount. It doesn't say he's going into a solitary place. It just says he's going up into a mountain. And in Luke 6, before the Sermon on the Plain, the setting is that, again, it's a mountain. It doesn't say he's going up into a solitary place. It just says he's going up into a mountain to pray. So the possibility that Eremos Heights is the location of the Sermon on the Mount, and perhaps also the Sermon on the Plain, is not clear. It's not obvious. And on the websites I saw, they admit that it's a supposed place, a believed place where the Beatitudes were spoken. And they have a church, I believe it's like an 8-sided church, where they say it's the church of the Beatitudes or something like that. But it's not absolutely certain. So the certainty that he puts in this appendix note, I think, is misplaced. So where he says this means that it is a mountain, yes, it's a mountain, and it has a level place, yes, as Luke describes, doesn't point absolutely to this being the place of the Sermon on the Mount. And it may also not be the place of the Sermon on the Plain. It's not clear. Next he says, there are similarly worded and successive phrases between Matthew's version of the sermon and Luke's version, and the conclusion that it is the same sermon is virtually unavoidable. Again, I don't think that's certain. How many times have you or I or anyone you know repeated an important lesson or a teaching at 2 different places at 2 different times? There are plenty of times where Jesus says something almost exactly the same in one place and another. For example, there are 2 places, once in Matthew, once in Luke, where, again, I'll get into this. Someone comes up to him and says, I'll follow you wherever you go. And Jesus says, foxes have holes, birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. And once in Matthew, once in Luke, but they're totally different times. One is just before or around the time that he crosses over the lake, calms the storm, and then meets the Gadarene demoniac. The other is way later, totally separate time, and I go through that again, and I have to admit that they were so different in timing that I keep them as 2 separate events because I believe they actually are. That's just one example of where Jesus says something, it seems exactly the same, but they're probably 2 different events. Again, people come up to him asking him about fasting, where they're fasting, John's disciples fasting, or other people fast, but Jesus and his disciples are feasting. How can they be eating when everyone else is engaged in religious activity and denying themselves? And Jesus says, well, there's a time to fast and there's a time to feast. And 2 different times he says that. Once right when he comes back from exorcising the Gadarene demoniac, and the other time I'm actually not sure, I don't quite remember. But it's very clear they are different times. So just because Jesus says very similarly worded phrases and statements and gives an important lesson does not mean they were spoken at the same time. Now, I'll admit there is a time where Jesus says something that's the same, and I believe they were said at the same time, or I just move it there for memorization's sake to make it easy, like when he's speaking about divorce. He says that in Matthew 5 or 6 or 7, the Sermon on the Mount, and it's pretty inclusive, but then he says it again in Matthew 19, way later. But for the sake of having all of that teaching in one place, and because they are slightly different, and he has something included in one that he doesn't have in the other, and I want it to be all in one place, I do put those together. And again, when I get to that point, I'll have it all explained. But that's because it's extremely unclear of what timeline Matthew is following. And again, I could be wrong about that. But with the other issues of Jesus saying foxes have holes, birds of the air have nests, or talking about feasts and fasts, those were 2 obviously different. So I have those separate, but with divorce, I put them together. Again, there are reasons that I get into, but this is not a virtually unavoidable conclusion, as stated by Gary Crossland. Now, those are simply reasons not to believe his conclusions, but why should you believe that the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain may be different? Well, in Matthew 5, let's go there. What happened just before is what I had just completed. There followed him great multitudes of people from Galilee and from Decapolis and from Jerusalem, from Judea and from beyond Jordan. Now, chapter 5 immediately follows. And seeing the multitudes, he went up into a mountain. He went up into a mountain. That's the first big clue. Let's look at Luke real fast. Luke 6:17. This surrounds him naming the apostles. Right after he healed the man with the withered hand, they were really upset. They wanted to kill him. They were filled with madness. Luke 6:11, they were filled with madness and communed one with another what they might do to Jesus. Verse 12, and it came to pass in those days, he went up into a mountain to pray. So in Matthew 5, he went up to preach, right? He went up into a mountain. When he was set, the disciples came to him, and he opened his mouth and taught. So in Luke, he also is going up into a mountain, but to pray. And it says, still, verse 12, and continued all night in prayer to God. So he's not going up to preach, he's going up the mountain to pray. And when it was day, all night he was praying. So now that it's daytime, he called to him his disciples, and of them he chose 12, whom he named apostles. After he names all them, verse 17, he came down with them and stood in the plain. He came down. Okay? Now that he's down from the mountain and in a plain, the company of his disciples and a great multitude of people out of all Judea and Jerusalem and from the seacoast of Tyre and Sidon, they came to hear him and to be healed of their diseases. And they that were vexed with unclean spirits, they were healed, and the whole multitude sought to touch him. For there went virtue out of him and healed them all. And he lifted up his eyes on his disciples and said, Blessed be you poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you that hunger, blessed are you that weep. So he's going into the blessed bees. But he came down from the mountain. It says he came down and was in a plain. Matthew, he went up the mountain, and that's where he preached. So these actions, his movements, is a pretty big clue that he's not in exactly the same place. Now, if it is the place Eremos Heights, that he came down from this hill, and now he's on the level place, you can't really say he came down from the mountain, because that mountain with a level place just below it is all part of that big hill, as Gary Crossland explained. You can say he came down from a mountain if he's still on this mountain with a level place on it. And especially, the reasons why he's moving is the next big clue. Seeing the multitudes, beginning of chapter 5 in Matthew, he went up into a mountain, and his disciples came to him and he preached. So he's going up because he sees the multitudes. In Luke, again, it says he's going up to pray. And then he comes down after he's done praying, after he's done naming his apostles. He comes down and seeing the multitudes. What does he do? He stays in the plain and he preaches. It does not say that because he sees the multitudes, he goes up. He goes up to pray. So these are the two big clues that I think the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain are actually different. Matthew and Luke are different events. Matthew, he goes up because he sees the crowds. Luke, earlier, the night before, he goes up to pray, but now he comes down into a plain, and that's where he preaches. It doesn't say he goes back up into a mountain. One of these, I believe, is the Composite Gospels, or the Combined Gospels, has that he comes down from the mountain, sees the multitudes, and then goes right back up the mountain and preaches. I guess maybe, but that's not said in Matthew or Luke. You're putting them together and having him do two things, where in Matthew he's doing one, and in Luke he's doing another. And I don't think that's honest to say he went down in Matthew, and then he went up in Luke, immediately followed. I don't think that's clear. And putting them together and saying he did this is not sure just because it says he went up and Matthew went down. The reasons are different, the timing is different. I just don't think you can put them together. So, because I think that they're different events, different sermons, I can have them separate. I can keep the Sermon on the Mount in the timing as it says in Matthew, even though, as I'll find out later, and I decide later, a lot of the portions of the Sermon on the Mount I'm going to move over and combine with Luke because they are almost exactly the same wording. But still, I'm going to have as two different events. The Sermon on the Mount is going to be a little bit shorter. The Sermon on the Plain is going to be a little bit longer now. But I'll have them as separate, and the healing of the leper now comes into question. It is right after, immediately after the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew. Matthew 8. Just after he's completed his sermon, the end of chapter 7, it came to pass when Jesus had ended these sayings, the people were astonished at his doctrine, for he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes. Then chapter 8 immediately followed. When he was come down from the mountain, great multitudes followed him, and behold, there came a leper, and worshipped him, saying, Lord, if you will, you can make me clean. Now, this chapter 8 has a bunch of activity that Jesus does, which I know is not all here. For example, the healing of Peter's wife's mother is here in chapter 8, when that clearly happened before, as explained in Mark and Luke. And the reasons I had already gone into that. He also has the calming of the storm right here. But there are other events in Matthew 12, like him eating the wheat or the corn, as it says in the King James Version. And he speaks about David eating the showbread that most likely happened before this. So I think chapter 8 is because this is the Gospel of the King. It's a record of all of his important activities, all of his achievements, saying, look at all he's done. He is worthy to be paid attention to. I think that's what Matthew does, puts a bunch of events here in Matthew 8. So you could say the first event listed, the healing of the leper, is just one of those. It's just one of his important events, his achievements that makes him noteworthy. So pay attention. And it's not exactly said that as he came down from the mountain, the leper came to him. It just says he came down from the mountain, great multitudes followed him. Verse 2, and behold, there came a leper. So the timing is not exactly stated, but it's possibly hinted at. Mark 1:38, it says he invites them to go into the next towns, that he may preach there also. Therefore came I forth. Verse 39, and he preached in their synagogues and throughout all Galilee, and cast out devils. I combine that with Matthew, that he's going out into all Galilee. Then verse 40, and there came a leper to him, beseeching him and kneeling down to him and saying to him, if you will, you can make me clean. So this could be sometime that he's preaching by himself. It could be. It's not exactly stated. Or it could be, as it says in Matthew, right after he did the Sermon on the Mount. It's not really said when. And clearly, Mark doesn't have the Sermon on the Mount, so that could have been right in between verse 39 and 40. He went out and preached throughout all Galilee, as it says in Matthew, the end of chapter 4, then the Sermon on the Mount, chapter 5, 6, 7, and then chapter 8, and combine that with Mark 1:40 here, there came a leper. It could be that way. Luke, chapter 5, is when he comes again to call Peter, Andrew, James, and John. They're fishing. He helps them with that large catch of fish. They make a small fortune. They finally follow him. And then immediately it goes into, after verse 11, and when they had brought their ships to land, they forsook all and followed him. Verse 12, and it came to pass, when he was in a certain city, behold, a man full of leprosy, who seeing Jesus fell on his face and besought him, saying, Lord, if you will, you can make me clean. The events are so similar that they've got to be the same here. Healing of this leper. So he calls these disciples. They finally follow him. They forsook all. And when he's in a certain city, when is that? You don't know. We don't know. It's not stated. Sometime in the future. So I could have, he calls the disciples, the Sermon on the Mount from Matthew, and then combined with Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the healing of the leper. It's not stated exactly when in Mark or Luke. Luke is actually the least clear because it came to pass in a certain city, sometime in the future. This is the most clear that it's not one then the other. There's a certain amount of time that has passed, and that could be what happens in Matthew. So because the Sermon on the Mount is different than the Sermon on the Plain, and because Matthew has it just before the healing of the leper, and because Mark is also not absolutely clear when it happens, just says after he goes about preaching, I might as well just keep it in the order of Matthew. If I was going to move a verse or a story out of order from one gospel, I'd better have a reason. A good reason. And I don't think there's that great of a reason to move it. So I think it'd be best just to leave it in the order of Matthew. The Sermon on the Mount, then he heals the leper, and then all the other of the events that clearly take place right away.